When I went to Roscommon about 6 years ago, I did meet up with a guy who may or may not be related, and he told me that he had relatives come probably in the 1950s from America, and from what he told me, these are those relatives. The challenge I now have, of course, is to connect him to me, but we now have a lot more information as a result of American records than exist purely from the any other source, basically. Reasons to be cheerful. Number two, a lot of the Irish records that do exist can be searched free of charge. They're available online, so you don't have to wait for the Government Record Office to come back in a few weeks or even months' time and charge you whatever, £9 for the privilege. Here we can see this is my great uncle Thomas, died at the age of 34. It's reported by Bridget, his mother, who is illiterate. It's her mark. He died of chronic bronchitis and asthma and exhaustion. So those are all available. You can quickly find out if it's the right one you're looking for. Reason to be not quite so cheerful. Church records for Ireland, where they do exist, are in Latin. The surnames stay the same, the Christian names are different. So surnames yet we recognise. John will appear as Johannes. Something wrong with one of my light bulbs. It's going to go in a minute. Patrick as Patricius. There are quite a lot of guides to Church Latin available online. For example, Family Search, the Mormon website, has one. And you will have fun with church records. Handwriting, in this case, is quite good. Many of them are absolutely appalling. And they are also rather fond of using obscure abbreviations. The other thing is, in rural parishes, records weren't kept normally until after Catholic emancipation, which took place in 1829 with the Roman Catholic Relief Act. Prior to that, they were quite often using mass stones such as this, because prior to that, holding masses was technically illegal, although hadn't been enforced for many years. The other thing is that lots of records haven't survived. So this is St Bridget's Church in Kilbride at 4 Mile House, so called because it's 5 miles from the centre of centre of Roscommon, 4 Irish miles there. And there are baptisms for a long period, but relatively light on marriages and deaths. And frankly, there's not a lot you can do about that. Whoops, slide forward, sorry, page forward, help. Standard warning is, of course, that events are supposed to be reported within, I think, 3 months, with fines for late compliance. So what they've tended to do, of course, was register the births and bend the truth on when they were actually born. The baptism records tend to be more accurate, and I would normally recommend to take those as the more reliable guide. Reasons to be Cheerful, Part 3, which I believe was the name of a song by Ian Dury in 1979. If you're looking for relatives, you are not alone. I joined Facebook purely to join this group, County Roscommon Ireland Genealogy, which has 2,500–3,000 members. It's a mix of locals and people from the diaspora spread around the world, heavy concentration on Americans. The locals are very good for detailed information on names of places and things like that. But it is useful to share information, and I found some good stuff off that. Off that, I also found another group called Roscommon Ireland DNA, which inevitably is about people who shared their DNA, which brings me to that subject. DNA, of course, is of itself of limited value. It can tell you there is a connection, you still have to find it for yourself. And it can tell you there isn't one, which saves you an awful lot of time looking. Now, when I started my research, because the population of Stanleys amongst the labourer classes was quite small, I thought I'd come up with some theory of everything that linked all the Stanleys together in one family. And I now know that isn't true. Through the Roscommon Facebook group, I made contact with a guy who's a relative of a James Stanley, who was born in, let me show you on the map. My lot come from there in the middle, if you can see my pointer, and this other lot come from there, which, given those are 1 kilometre squares, that's mile and a half apart max. It turns out DNA has told us there is no connection between the lot there and the lot there. None at all. I wouldn't have believed it. And then I've also made contact with somebody whose family come from down in the corner here, the bottom left. And lo and behold, there's no connection between my lot and this lot either, or between the other lot. So we have 3 genetically separate groups in a very small and relatively unpopulated part of Ireland, which frankly I still find staggering, but that is the fact. On a more positive note, I have made contact with a 3rd cousin once removed as a result of DNA. I had a suspicion, the DNA has helped prove it. Other sources. Now this goes back to the creativity which I referred to earlier. Dog licenses. Now you have to be a pretty dedicated researcher, I think, to find leafing through dog licenses exciting, but I am one of those sad people. And down at the bottom, in the bottom corner here, we have John Stanley, who had a grey sheepdog. The thing about dog licenses, you had to renew them every year. So it fixes particular people in location. So if somebody was there in this case, 1875, and they're 72, 73, 74, 75, and then missing, that probably tells you when they might have moved. So, it does give clues. And for those of us looking in this particular field, any clue is better than nothing. Other things, they seem a little bit prone to going to law. And at the bottom here, we have John Stanley, who I believe is my great-grandfather, and he's claiming that his neighbour, Farrell, has assaulted him. So again, 1878, it fixes a particular person in a particular place. These are written in English, and they are relatively legible. So they're available on Find My Past. So next time we have a research evening, you can come along and have a look to see if you've got any relatives who tangle with the law from one side or the other. Recycling names, of course, is an issue. I've got John Stanley's well into double figures. As I've dug through, it seems every branch of every family called at least one son John. But of course, that's not unique. And if I go back to John Milstead, with whom I started, he actually named 3 of his sons Robert. And they lived for, I think, 3 weeks, 3 months, and 3 years, respectively. So presumably gave up calling any more than Robert after that. You just have to be careful. That's what happens. Ages, of course, with Irish records have to be treated with more caution than normal. The passage of Father Time wasn't that important. There weren't any benefits. They were age dependent. And for example, my grandfather didn't know his true age throughout most of his life. When it came to pension, he found he was a different age to what he thought. So I think at death, quite often relatives would just guess. Another positive thing is that when people moved, they clustered together. And if you have signs like that being displayed, that one's an American sign, help wanted, no Irish need apply. You can see they weren't always made to feel very welcome. They clustered. This is an extract from I think 1901 map or thereabouts of Dewsbury, and in the middle there, New Street, Back New Street, is where quite a lot of my relatives clustered. You can see it's all back-to-back housing, higgledy-piggledy, incredibly dense, very poor, but they all clustered there, I guess, because there were others who could find them a room. Might have to share it with about 8 other people, but they all stayed in one place. Further warning is there are still gaps even when the Irish records exist. So their 1901 census does exist, and you can look at it freely. But I've got Thomas, Bridget, and Patrick all missing from the 1901 census. Thomas, we now know, died in 1908. It was reported by his mother, Bridget, who died in 1909. And my grandfather might have been in the country and might not have been, but none of them are on the 1901 census. So, you know, it's the truism is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. More true probably with Irish records than anywhere else. So where do we go from this? Well, I've got some recommendations for you. I would certainly urge people to take a DNA test and upload it to GEDmatch. If you take it one test with one provider, you'll only see the matches they've got. GEDmatch, you can extract your data, download it and upload it to GEDmatch, which is a matching software, and then you can look at other people, and I found that really quite useful. Be patient. My closest match on the DNA popped out year or more after I started looking. I mean, people will have DNA tests for Christmas, therefore it's, you know, new stuff will appear all the time. I'd certainly recommend revisiting the old ground at regular intervals, because I spent huge amounts of time looking for emigration records for that Thomas, the one I showed you, only to find that my actual relative died in Roscommon, he'd never moved. And I'm sure that information wasn't there when I started looking. So it is worth going over things at regular intervals. Certainly to join the internet groups relevant to your area of interest, because we're all, as we already said, in the same boat. You know, we're desperate to find whatever information, and you never know what snippets people will have, what's written in family Bibles, the folklore that's been passed down through the generations. Publish. I've got a website, roscommonstanley.me.uk, and I use that to publish information that I found. What I then tend to do is tell the people on the Facebook group that I've published something, and a lot of them will track off and have a quick look. But again, it prompts information, and it's not that difficult to do. It costs, you know, relatively a single figure sum of pounds for a domain name, and for hosting, you know, it can be 10 or 15 pounds a year. So it's worth thinking about. You have to accept that there's a lot of dross. It's like panning for gold. You know, there's the odd nugget and a lot of, you know, complete rubbish in there, but that's the nature of the beast. I think certainly urge people to retain a critical mindset. I think one of the dangers we face with the Irish side of things is people are absolutely desperate to find relatives, and they'll latch on to something which may or may not be right. So they might find a John Stanley and go, oh, that's the right one. Well, it's one out of about 10, 15, 20 odd. So you have to be so careful. And then, of course, somebody else will find that information and conclude it's right. And they'll say, okay, that must be mine as well. And then 2 or 3 others. And by the time you've you know, gone a few steps down the way, lots of people all believe the same thing, which is completely untrue. Certainly a basic understanding of DNA, because it tells you roughly where to look. I mean, I've managed to connect with a distant relative, and we concluded our common ancestor was born in 1768, and that was in Sussex. It can't be any further back than that, it wouldn't be right, and it can't be any nearer than that, it wouldn't be right either. So, you know, it does tell you. So, you know, that's worth knowing. And finally, you have to accept that some answers will never be found. They might not exist anymore. So, you know, if you're expecting to find the answers, but then, as we said, we aren't doing this because it's easy. We're doing it because it's hard. And that concludes the talk. Thank you.
Hey.